Hello, Dr. Kerry, and welcome back to the channel.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, great. So today we are going to talk about gospel reliability. And for that, we're going to take a look at a video by Inspiring Philosophy. Maybe
Yeah,
you have heard of these guys. I think these are the
yeah,
main apologists in YouTube. So he has one video for each gospel. Today we're going to take a deep look at his video for the Gospel of Mark. And if we have time, we will just take a look at a few of the things for the other gospels. But it's like more of the same. So
yeah,
uh, Mark is the important one. Okay,
yeah,
so yeah, let's get to it. Yeah,
But as we noted, the unanimous attestation from the early church is that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, an interpreter and follower of Peter. The Gospel is never attributed to anyone else. Beyond this, Irenaeus said Mark, the disciple and recorder of Peter, has also handed on to us in writing what had been proclaimed by Peter. Tertullian tells us Mark was the interpreter of Peter. The Anti-Marcionite prologue records that Mark's Gospel came from Mark, the interpreter of Peter. Clement of Alexandria said Mark was a follower of Peter, who wrote down what he preached. Origen said the second gospel was that according to Mark, who wrote it according to Peter's instructions. Papias recorded that Mark was a follower and interpreter of Peter, who wrote down what Peter preached, and that Peter often accommodated his teachings to whom he was preaching to.
yeah, that's that's basically the first argument is like it's just the evidence we have for Mark being the interpreter of Peter and the author of the Gospel of Mark. That's like their first point. So what do you think
yeah.
about this?
I wrote an article on Christian apologetics as formalized gullibility. So this is a really gullible argument. I'm just astonished at how gullible Christians are. They'll believe any urban legend, right, and anything that it's Haitians eat pets, I guess, that kind of thing. This all originated with Papias, so all of those sources are just repeating what Papias said. Papias is writing like 100 years later, and we know from Eusebius that his methodology was really crappy, that he just believed whatever urban legends people told him. He did no critical inquiry. He had no actual written sources. He didn't, just believe whatever he was told, essentially. And Eusebius even chastises him for this. And he's the first to come up with this story that Mark must have been the interpreter of Peter. Where he got it, we don't really know. He doesn't say. It's like they say. It's just an urban legend, basically. So it's a late urban legend, so we're talking 30, 40, 50 or 60 years after the fact. This legend was just circulating. It's just people were claiming. People say, right? It's not only hearsay, it's a hearsay that can't even be attributed to a witness of any kind. And all those other sources are just reiterations of Papias. So whether they're consulting Papias or someone else who consulted Papias doesn't matter. It's just the same story gets telephone gamed along. So it really just originates with this crappy source Papias, and it can't be true. Is the other thing. So Matthew is the gospel that would be Peter's, if there was any gospel that was Peter's. Mark is anti-Petrine. So Mark is a pro-Pauline, anti-Petrine gospel. So there's no way Mark would be Peter's gospel. Mark is Paul's gospel, or at least the gospel of the sect that came out of Paul's wing of the church. The reason we know this is because Mark is pro-Gentile and anti-Torah. So he's basically like, we don't need the Torah. We don't need the Torah law. We don't need circumcision and dietary laws and all that stuff. We don't need that stuff anymore because of Jesus. Peter is the other side of this. Peter's no. You have to convert to Judaism, get circumcised, follow all the Torah laws and everything to become a Christian. So you have to be a Jew to be a Christian, and that was the Peter side, and that's in Matthew. So Matthew rewrites Mark to promote the Peter's sect's view of things. So it's clear that Papias or his source, whoever it was, had no idea what was going on, like who these gospels, who the authors were, whose sect they were trying to promote. They clearly had no reliable information on this. And a lot of these names, they come out of Paul, often the letters of Paul, often the forged letters of Paul. So they're just pulling these names that they could connect, right? So Mark shows up in some of the Peter's letters, and it shows up elsewhere, and so they figure, we'll just make up the story that Mark is there for. Peter's scribe or whatever. That doesn't make any sense logically. Another side of this is there's a ton of scholarship lately, like the last 20 years, that have shown that the Gospel of Mark is built out of the epistles of Paul. That in fact there's direct lifts and structural elements and stuff using literary mimesis, which is the style of literature at the time. They're building this. Mark is using Paul's letters as a guide to build out stories with. So Mark is actually Paul's sect, not Peter's. So it doesn't make any sense as Peter's sect. The Markan Gospel is actually kind of anti-Peter, right? It's Peter's kind of gets dissed in this. Peter gets rehabilitated in Matthew. Matthew takes the material from Mark about Peter, including the fall of Peter and his return, his rise, essentially. It's sort of the hero's story. But Matthew has much more detail. He imports much more detail, making very clear Peter's authority and that Jesus accepted Peter and so on, even more than Mark had. So even Mark had to acknowledge that Peter was important. He was the first apostle and so on, even because Paul himself attests to that. So Mark has to tell that story, but he can still throw shade on Peter and show that Peter's not the best apostle. But in a way, that's a message about all Christians, right? Not all Christians can be perfect. Matthew, however, kind of improves that a little. He keeps that narrative, but he kind of improves. He throws some more material on it that makes Peter sort of a better-looking hero in this story. So so anyway, Matthew. This would be a plausible story about Matthew. It's not a plausible story about Mark.
Oh. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So I also had a few slides on this. I just want to add some of these things on Papias. Like
yeah,
say,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Most mentions are really late. Like the only early one is Papias. The others one are super late. So the question is, how reliable is Papias?
Yeah, I think you're right to point this out. That these are really this is like the Roswell flying saucer, right? Like this is 40 years later. There's wild stories circulating and people just believe them. But so you can't really trust the wild, the Men in Black and all of that stuff. Like these kinds of urban legends grow. Can't really trust them. The date of Papias, I would disagree with. Just point that out. I know there are a lot of scholars who want Papias to be around 100 AD. The general consensus is to put him a decade or two later. I think he's even later than that. And I have an article just recently where I did a review of the recent best study of Papias that just came out, and you can check that on my blog, where I talk about what that scholar argues. But they're very honest about this, is that we don't really know the date of Papias. It's all conjecture. And so you can kind of hopefully date him early, or you can pessimistically date him late. We don't know, because he fits in basically a 40-year window, possibly 50-year window, that he could be at the end of, the start of, the middle of. We don't know. And so, yeah, is Papias really that early? All we can say is he's no earlier than that. So he's already, that if you put it at 100, that's 30 years, 25 to 30 years. That's a whole generation after Mark wrote. So this is not a contemporary source.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Also, something else important about Papias. He reposed a silly legend about Judas' death, which not only is a very silly legend about how he became so bloated as a wagon, or very, very stupid stuff, it also contradicts the narration in the Gospel of Matthew. So it already tells us about how likely he was to just repeat silly legends he heard. And I got another sample of this. He reports a legend about Christians swallowing like deadly poison. Most people don't point that out. But Eman points out the one about Judas, but this one I never see it. This is the part where he mentions Mark, the authorship of Mark. Also, this is actually like the same text. Just a few lines earlier, he's telling us about people rising from the dead, other than Jesus, and about Barsabbas, how he swallowed deadly poison and received no harm, right? It's like, I mean, I don't have a proof that this didn't happen, but it's like the point is that nobody believes this kind of story. So he's the kind of man who will just repeat silly legends that he heard from others. Like
no, it's just like grandma on the internet believing any crazy story that shows up, as long as it agrees with what she wants to be true. And then you just can't disabuse her of that belief. It's like, Mom, that didn't happen. Haitians aren't eating pets. That's not a thing. And it's like it's just there's no Men in Black. That's not a thing. It's like this. So it's like he's very ready. He's like the conspiracy mind, the sort of conspiracy theory mind today is very prone, very easily believing ridiculous stories. We even had a guy shoot up a pizza parlor here in the U.S. over this, right? Like that they just readily believe what mythical stories come across their desk, essentially. And Papias is very much one of these kinds of people. He's just a really gullible person who's just ready to believe ridiculous things, and he has no critical thinking skills whatsoever. Does no research. He's even off the idea of books. It's like, I don't check things in books. Who does that, right? Like that's kind of his attitude. So yeah, this is a very unreliable author, and as you point out, very late author. And then everybody else is just repeating what he said. So there's no independent attestation or evidence to corroborate this tale, this sort of legend. It's just what the Christians wanted to believe. It's not, and I should say it's what the post-Marcionite Christians wanted to believe. When Marcion talks about the Gospels, he seems to have no idea that they're associated with anybody by name. Marcion has no knowledge of names being assigned to these Gospels. That appears to be a decision made by the anti-Marcionite sect when they published their anti-Marcionite edition. They are the ones who chose all these names. So the legends about these names probably arose later. This is one of the reasons why I think Papias probably wrote much later than people think, towards the end of the window in which he could have written. Anyway, I talk about a lot of this in Stephen Carlson's, in my review of Stephen Carlson's book on this. I should point out that the Judas story, Carlson makes a case that the most ridiculous version of that Judas story is a telephone game, not in Papias, but from Papias. Like Papias tells a simpler story, which is also ridiculous, but it gets embellished over time. And so the version that I used to quote all the time might not be a direct quote of Papias. It might be sort of ridiculous embellishments on Papias by later authors. But even then, if you go back to what probably Papias originally wrote, assuming Carlson is right about this, I'm undecided about this. But if he's right about this, the pared down version is still ridiculous and obviously not true, and Papias readily believed it, just uncritically, right? They didn't fact check it, had no skepticism whatsoever. And so your point is correct there, and that's why this is not a good argument. But it really illustrates how modern Christians are still super gullible. Like they just believe ridiculous things, urban legends and unsourced hearsay and stuff like that. Just readily believe it and even use it as like a assertive proof that they're right. And that tells you that they're not very good at this. We can't really trust their judgment when it comes to things like this.
Yeah. Okay, the next argument is about how Mark seems to be translated from Aramaic. So here it is.
Within the Gospel of Mark, we find an interesting phenomenon. The Greek is sometimes worded strangely. This language is cleaned up by both Luke and Matthew. Some have argued this indicates Mark was a clumsy author, but this is unlikely because Maurice Casey has pointed out when we recreate Aramaic versions, the language of Mark makes more sense. What we find is Mark was translating many literal Aramaic sayings of Jesus into Greek, which explains why his Greek is worded as it is. Casey says, passages such as Mark 1:39-43 and 11:15-17 show a large amount of parataxis and verbs placed near the beginnings of sentences. While both these phenomena occur in crude and or Semitizing Greek, in true stories about events in Aramaic-speaking communities, they are more likely to be due to the translation of Aramaic sources.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's what I say.
That statement at the end there, the more likely part, is false. Maurice Casey was kind of a weirdo, and he's kind of an outlier. Not a lot of scholars really are convinced by his work. I have a whole thing. You can go to my blog and check out, search his name, Maurice Casey. I've got a whole thing on it. And I've got a whole section on this where a lot of scholars are pointing out that no, that's Mark is just doing Semitized Greek. And in fact, it's just a Septuagintal style, right? So that's the thing, right? So it's worth pointing out that Aramaic was the lingua franca of the Middle East at the time. So pagan Syrians, the Mesopotamians, even a lot of Egyptians, Aramaic was a very common language. So to have someone who speaks a sort of Semitized Greek doesn't even mean that you're Jewish, right? It doesn't even prove that you're connected to Judaism, or much less first century Judaism. It was just a common tongue, basically. So And then a lot of Maurice Casey's examples are like that, where there's actually no evidence of an underlying Aramaic whatsoever, because the evidence matches exactly the kind of thing that you would get if you're emulating the Septuagint or you speak in this particular dialect. It's commonplace. The ones that are the closest fits, where you actually see mentions of Aramaic and that gets translated, every single one of those links back to the Old Testament. So there, for instance, the cry on the cross goes back to Psalm 22. There's a phrase that comes out of a resurrection of the young girl that comes from stories of Elijah, and so on. That these things trace back to Targums. So that Targums were Aramaic paraphrases of the Old Testament. And we know Mark used the Old Testament a lot to emulate his stories. So a lot of to build a story. So his stories about Jesus are often emulations of Elijah or emulations of Moses. And so he takes stories that already existed in the Bible and then rewrites them, modernizes them, puts Jesus in the main character role, and then changes up some of the value messaging of it and so on. And we have lots of scholars and scholarship pointing this out. This is how Luke composes. And so some of the most blatant Aramaic lifts come from these Targums. And so that doesn't go back to history. And in fact, you take the case of the resurrection of a little girl, like that doesn't make any sense as a real historical event. You read it, it's obviously fiction, right? So it clearly doesn't go back to a real story. And the cry on the cross, the whole construction, Mark's entire construction of the crucifixion narrative is built out of Psalm 22, and that's obviously not history. That's literary art, essentially. So the cry on the cross that's not a witnessed event. And Mark, of course, puts no witnesses there, right? There's no Christians present to have heard this cry on the cross anyway. He very conveniently gets them all to run away before that scene happens. So Mark is clearly not imagining this as something Jesus actually said. It's all a literary story about the tale of Jesus, and he's borrowing material from prophecy and Psalms and other stories to try and build out his narrative of the sort of message he wants to send about this. So he's basically, the point is the message of the story, not the literal details. Mark is not writing a literal history. He's writing a sort of messaging document that is meant to give essentially parables about Jesus, with Jesus as the main character, right? And so that just illustrate aspects of the gospel. So anyway, the Maurice Casey's thesis completely collapses on analysis, and a lot of scholars agree with this. There's no underlying Aramaic. There's no Aramaic Mark floating around out there and there's no Aramaic oral lore that Mark was translating. There's no evidence of that being the case. And since you can't establish that, this doesn't really work as an argument, right? So we already have good enough explanations, even better explanations, of the material that Casey and others are pointing to.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so the next is probably one of the most popular arguments. It's the argument from confirmed details, that Mark has some details about the world that have been confirmed.
Strengthens this by pointing out Mark preserves accurate Jewish customs. In Mark 6:56, we are told Jesus had a fringe of his garment, which is consistent with the biblical command for men to wear tassels on their clothing. He also upheld the biblical law of appearing before a priest and going out to dwell in the wilderness when people began to find out he touched a leper. Mark 2:23-28, which Casey identifies as originally in Aramaic, presents a dispute between Jesus and the Pharisees on plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath. Casey notes the dispute recorded in Mark 2:23-24 is very intra-Jewish. Greg Boyd also notes that Mark accurately describes the political landscape of the religious community in the region. In Mark, the scribes are a distinct group from the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they come up to Galilee from Jerusalem, which is accurate in terms of group distinctions and where the scribes were headquartered, as the scribes are seen as a separate class in the religious divisions. The title the scribe of the Pharisees is portrayed as someone who was an intellectual leader of the Pharisees, and Mark also suggests the Sadducees are absent in Galilee, which corresponds to what we know about the time and region. Mark also
Yeah, so that's the argument, that there are many details.
That's another really dumb argument. Obviously, there are tons of Jews everywhere in the empire, right? So, there's no reason why someone writing in the 2nd century would know all that same stuff. Not only would they know it from knowing Jews, who are probably in their community, as well as around their community and stuff. So the practices, Jewish practices, were everywhere, and therefore visible to everybody. But also, and if we figure, I think Mark is writing early 70s, late 70s AD, so he's super close to first century customs and things like that. But all that lore and all that knowledge would be circulating in Rome, even. It would be circulating in Spain. It would be circulating in North Africa. It would be everywhere. So there's no particular reason to tie that to first century Judaism. Even like the historical geographical stuff was ubiquitously available. So like that stuff was in reference books. It was common lore. People knew about it. Pilgrims were a common thing. So there's like the ability to get that kind of information just 30, 40 years later would have been easy, right? So that doesn't prove there was any kind of connection to actual sources. It just means that Mark knows stuff, right? He knows about Judaism. He knows about Jewish customs. He knows the lore and history of geography of early Palestine, just as second century historians did. You pick any historian who wrote about it, they also know all this stuff. So that doesn't really tell you anything about eyewitnessing. It's kind of a non sequitur, essentially. It's like saying that there's no way an author can write accurate historical fiction, therefore all historical fiction is history. And obviously that's a bad argument, right? No, the truth is people could write good historical fiction because they were closer to these facts than we are, right? So they have better access to this data than we do. So there's no reason to even assume that this comes from eyewitnesses, for example. Yeah. I should also point out there was another argument in there about the Pharisees, right? So Casey is so bad at this. The late Casey, I should say. In actual fact, it's the other way around. So to give you a better example, a clearer example, is the dispute in Mark over the healing on the Sabbath, right? The question of healing on the Sabbath. Now, in Mark, it's depicted as all the Pharisees are against this, and Jesus is for it, and he's poning them with like clever quips and stuff like that. In reality, in early first century Judea, most Pharisees would be deciding with Jesus on this. So there were actually two camps. There were the liberal Pharisees and the conservative Pharisees. The liberal Pharisees appear to have been more numerous, and their rulings tended to override conservative in most cases, as far as we can tell, given the evidence that we have. And the liberals were just came from the camp of Hillel, this particular rabbi that started the more liberal interpretation of the Torah. And the others, the conservatives, come from Shammai, this other rabbi who's super ultra-conservative. And so you had, just like today, you have the ultra-conservative Jews are kind of like this angry minority, and then you've got most Jews are liberal minded. And that was the same case with the Pharisees. So if that had really happened, if that argument between Jesus and the Pharisees over healing on the Sabbath had really happened, like the majority of Pharisees would have walked over to Jesus' side and would have been arguing with him against the conservative Pharisees. So the fact that, and you have to ask, like, does Mark not know this? It's possible Mark doesn't know this, that his knowledge of this kind of granular detail is not good. I suspect he does know this. He certainly knows that there's the Hillelites and the Shammaites and the liberal and conservative interpretations, because that stuff was everywhere. There's no way he couldn't know this. So when he's telling this story, he's deliberately writing a fake story. This is an anachronistic, oversimplified, not historically accurate story, because Mark is not going for accuracy, right? His whole point is, I'm just going to say that all the Pharisees are the conservatives. They're just going to represent the conservative point of view in my story. Jesus will take the positive side, keep it simple, and then we'll have the argument in there. So it's all about presenting the argument. It's not about trying to be historically accurate. It's not historically accurate. It's completely fictional. It's anachronistic, actually. So that tells us that Mark is doing literary art. He's not trying to recreate stories accurately, and he's not being told. He doesn't have oral lore here, because oral lore would not have read out this way. Oral lore would have had, most of the Pharisees siding with Jesus in this argument, and you would have like a very different story, right? Would have been passed down. So that's, I take that point. When it comes to like the heads of the grain, that's a much more complicated story, because the objection, it's unclear what the objection really is from the sort of anachronistically represented Pharisees. And so you'd have to go digging in to the Hillelite versus Shammaiite side on the poor traveler eating on the Sabbath, right? And says, like, what are the exceptions? what is too much, what is a violation and what isn't. Like that gets super in the weeds. Mark makes it more about just, well, we can do things. He sort of oversimplifies the story where he makes, well, we can do what is necessary for life on the Sabbath because it was made for us, yada yada. So it's a clever parable to sort of sell the idea that Mark wants to sell. Whether it's historically accurate or not, that's unclear. But even if it was, again, like I said, like Mark had access to all of this knowledge, no matter what decade he wrote in. And so he could pick and choose how he represents it. He's going to make it as simple as possible so the argument can be clear. Whether that ends up being anachronistic or not is incidental, because Mark isn't concerned about that. So some of his stuff might be accurate, some of it might not, but that's not really his interest. His interest is telling the stories, and it's the meaning of the story that matters to him, not the minutia, essentially.
Yeah. So there is also another minor point here about the dating of Mark. So
between elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. But these distinctions ceased to exist after 70 AD. As Martin Hengel notes, after 70, this whole pluralistic political and religious landscape, which Mark depicts quite accurately in broad outline, was destroyed.
Yeah. So here is
that's
the
not
thing.
True. That's not true. No, in fact, what happened after the war, it was just some sort of magic wand got waved and all the other sects of Judaism just vanished, right? They didn't just disappear in a single year. No, what happened after the war is you had a sort of gradual, slow collapse of sectarian views into a sort of like common view. And that took time, right? Like it took like 100 or more years. And you still see the Shammaites. There are still conservative Shammaites centuries later, right? And the liberals as well. So the internecine disputes between different factions of Pharisees, that didn't go away. But a lot of the minor sects did sort of dissolve, and there was a sort of a growing, took a long time, but a growing consensus towards a more Pharisaic view of Judaism is what evolved out of that. And you see that even in Josephus, where he talks about he was a Pharisee. He sampled all the sects and was a Pharisee by the time the war started. But it's clear from his point of view that the other sects weren't wiped out. They were still around. It's just they were becoming less and less popular. And so there was more rallying around sort of one single narrative. But that took hundreds of years to finally play out. So there's no, like, it just disappeared. So there's no way Mark could have written about this or known about this right after the war. I mean, Mark is writing in, let's say, 76 or 78. He was alive in 60 or 50, right? So like it's not like this stuff would have been unknown to him as some sort of mystery. And so, yeah, that's not a good argument. It's a non sequitur again.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I wanted to make. I wanted to say that even if he had been destroyed in the 70s, Mark will have the knowledge of how it was. So that's all it takes for Mark to write it. So it doesn't prove anything. So I also have a few slides about this argument for confirmed details.
Oh, yeah, so this is good. I like this. Yeah.
Yeah. So the regular skeptic response is like the Spiderman analogy, is to say, oh, well, just because Spiderman mentions New York and the city exists, it doesn't mean that the story is true, right? But apologists usually complain about this. They say that the comparison is flawed because the genre is just too different, right? So I tried to find a better counterexample, and I think I found a really good one. There's something called the letter of Aristeas. You know about it. It's a known fake for the 10th century. It's about how the Septuagint code got made. So, but scholars didn't really recognize it as a fake until the 17th century, because it appears real in some ways. And I started reading it. I began reading it, and I started writing all the historical persons or cities or things that it mentioned. And look how much stuff it has. It mentions Eleazar, the high priest of the Jews. It correctly mentions Demetrius of Palermo, someone who had an important position in the king's library. It mentions Sosibius of Tarentum as captain of the bodyguard. I checked all of this in Google. It's not just like I found it and the letter mentioned it. I checked the details to see if they were historical, and they were. It correctly mentions Arsinoe II as a queen consort. It correctly mentions the coin that was used, right? It mentions details about our war campaign of Thrasymachus II, and these are the most impressive one. It correctly mentions Judean auxiliaries in Egypt's war against Cush. And here's something that scholars say here in the red part. No scholar known to me has questioned the veracity of the information concerning the sending of Judean mercenaries to aid Psammetichus in his war against the Ethiopian king. So this is what real, and it was included in the letter, right? And here's what some scholars had said about this, about the author of the letter of Aristeas. He infuses his work with historical details from Hellenistic Alexandria. So he includes historical details in his fictional work, in his forgery. It's a hoax, but he included historical details. There's no problem about it, right? Yeah. So that's it. That's all I wanted to show.
There's a lot of examples where historical fiction and propaganda and things can because there was a ton of sources that they could get. Like a lot of this was written about, so you can go grab details from sources, and they would have to make a mistake for us to notice this, right? For us to notice that they're pulling that stunt, and not everybody's going to make a mistake all the time, right? So like you mentioned the Spider-Man books, right? It's going to be rare that a Spider-Man book gets wrong something about, let's say, 1940s New York, right? Because they're going to go through their effort to try and make sure they get the details right. The same kinds of data that a modern writer has to build believable historical fiction today existed back then too. And in fact, it was publicly available. Like most cities, if not every major city, certainly every major city in the Roman Empire, had public libraries. You couldn't check out books, but you could read anything in there. There are research libraries, like a research library today. You have to read it in the library, but all of it's publicly available. It was actually funded by the state. So it's basically like this sort of socialist largesse in a way. But those libraries, prestige for the city was based on how well packed its library was in terms of books. So yeah, you could find all kinds of reference materials to build this sort of stuff out with. And in fact, they would have all the stuff that we have. So when we go around trying to make these same arguments, like say, oh, look, they got this right and this right and this right. How do we know that? Well, because we're consulting books. What books? The same books they had, right? And of course, they had even more than that. They had 10 to 100 times more books than have survived for us to read. So they are better informed. These fictional writers are better informed than we are. So there's no way we're going to go around and say, oh, that must be accurate because look how accurate he is. There's no way that could be. It's the other way around, right? Like they had a better access to this sort of reference material to make good historical fiction than we have now to sort of vet it. So yeah, that argument doesn't work. I go through this and some of the scholarship on this in my discussion of the Book of Acts. So on my blog, you can find Acts as a fake history, and you can read about how I detail this and how scholars have commented on this very point that I just made. Because the Book of Acts is built in the same way, that they're lifting materials from sources, sometimes making mistakes, which is how we know they're lifting their material from books and not from eyewitnesses or anything like that. But it shows the sort of way these sort of books get constructed. And you can look at there are like tons of apocryphal acts and apocryphal gospels. And as they get further away in time, they get less and less accurate, but they're not completely inaccurate, right? They're able to, sort of invent things that are believable, while they're also at the same time inventing things that aren't believable. I gave the example of Mark, and the debate over healing on the Sabbath is completely unrealistic historically. But in that case, that was a deliberate choice on his part, I think. So anyway, yeah, your argument here is correct. I think you've got the right point.
Yeah. Okay, next is an interesting argument is the one from onomastic congruency. It's the idea that the names in the Gospels statistically match the names that we had back then.
Yeah.
Mark received his information from eyewitnesses is the appearance of onomastic congruence in his Gospel. Luke Vandewey says, onomastic congruence refers to the creation of naming patterns by an ancient author that appropriately reflects the data of relevant prosopographies. In other words, an ancient work has onomastic congruence if the names within the body of the work align well with the ratio of names we find from that period. Vandewey put this to the test and surveyed the naming patterns in various ancient works to see which ones would contain onomastic congruence. The apocryphal Gospels, various tragedies and novels, were found to lack onomastic congruence. Surprisingly, even some Greco-Roman biographies failed to achieve onomastic congruence. Bauckham lists other examples where ancient authors included names irrelevant for the...
Yeah.
That's completely bogus. Balcom's methodology is completely unmathematical and bordering on dishonest. So there have been several studies that have actually caught him on this. He makes a bunch of suspicious mistakes in all of his analyses. So Camille Gregor and some others have published more than one article on this. I cite them and discuss this and more, not just their work and other points in my new book.
Let me show you real quick. I want to show them where they can find this.
Excellent.
There's one video in Paulogia. It's about 37 minutes. It goes like quickly over this information, like what's the response. And there is a longer video on Mid-Vision. It's over 3 hours. They go very deeply on this, and they show like the statistical mistakes that were made in the study. I have them here, but go ahead and tell us about it.
No, those good. I say people should check those videos out. I'm sure they'll get you up to speed. I get into more like technical detail in my book, The Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus, where I really take this to task. But it's wrong in multiple levels. The onomastic accuracy of like even actual historical biographies is questionable. There's all the stuff outside there's kind of dubiousness of the way that methodology is done. Balcom himself has not done a very good job of that. But that's a whole separate question. The real question that matters is, are the Gospels, and what Balcom did is he did all the Gospels, not just Mark, but the points holds for Mark as well, is that there's not congruence. In fact, the name frequencies don't match. There's a lot of really common names in early first century Palestine that don't show up at all, or nearly as often as they should. So for instance, there should be a lot more people named Jesus, right? There's one of the most common male names. So the fact that there's only one Jesus kind of tells you that this is not going on, right? This is not an accurate representation of the historical world. This is a literary choice to get rid of everybody named Jesus, right? That didn't happen historically. Mark is making the conscious choices. I'm not going to have anybody else named Jesus but Jesus. It's possible you can make an argument that he did name Barabbas Jesus in the original text. Now we don't have any manuscripts saying that, and you could go into detail as to why that was. But that was also a literary choice if he did that, because the whole point is Jesus, son of the Father, Jesus Barabbas, it means son of the Father. So two Jesus sons of the Father receiving two different treatments is an obvious literary device, right? So, but there should be even more Jesuses than that, right? There are other names that should be much more common. They should show up. So that part of the frequency argument doesn't work. The other part of the frequency argument is that there are names in Mark that don't make any sense for early first century Palestine, like Bartimaeus, for instance. That's clearly a completely inaccurate, not appropriate name, but it has some sort of mythical literary significance. So he just put that in there, right? And there are other examples of that. The third problem is that the names that show congruence, let's say, are almost all biblical names. So like Mary and Joseph are, for example, it's called the major. They're super common names, but they're super common names because they're names with literary meaning, right? So like if you're going to make a story, a sort of parable about Jesus, you're going to put characters in it that carry these names to signify symbolically certain things. So like even when they have multiple Marys, he designates them by different kinds of Mary. and Mary, of course, is the sister of Moses, for those who don't know. That's a super common name, and it's rich with symbolical meaning. To call someone Mary in a story carries meaning. And so like there's a literary reason to emulate the same frequency of real names, because you're emulating the mythical names that were super popular as well. And in fact, the highest frequency names in Mark are these mythical names, right? So his congruence matches sort of literary and mythical tendencies. It doesn't match what historical reality would be. So the statistics are all off, really. And so I point this out with a variety of examples in my book. There's a statistical argument in the Gregor and Blyce papers. There's been a rebuttal, but we're waiting for a response to that rebuttal. The rebuttal's not really intelligible. Anyway, so there's the debate going on. But the points that I just made are obvious and indisputable. You can't undo the fact that there aren't enough Jesuses, that there's a bunch of missing names. and that the most common names are already mythical names that we know, right? So yeah, the argument is terrible and should never have been believed. This is another example of modern Christian gullibility, that they didn't check. They just believed what Balcom said, and oh, this is amazing, and they just believed it. They didn't think to check and see, wait a minute, is that even true? Hold on, Balcom's not even telling the truth about what's in the manuscripts or what's in the text. So there's issues there that do reflect this Christian gullibility, and I think that's why their arguments aren't very effective with non-Christians, like, because we're not gullible like this. Like, we don't fall for stunts like this, but Christians do. That's why they're Christians, I guess, is that they easily fall for stories like this. And aren't very critically minded. If they were more critically minded, they wouldn't fall for these things, and then eventually it'd probably not be a Christian anymore. Eventually, right? I think that's what's going on here, and it's another example of that.
Yeah, I also want to show a couple of points that I think are important here. One of them, what I think is a great point, is that there are some names that are not contested of being invented. For example, the name Herod. They would have not invented the name. They would have asked, okay, who was the king back then, and they would have included the real name. So later, if you compare to a statistical way and you say, oh, as if he had invented all the names, but this is false, because he wouldn't have invented the name Herod or the name Pontius Pilate, right? So that's a very important point. And some of the names, for example, would have been taken from Paul's letter. For example, this is a huge one. The names of the disciples, Peter and whatever, So these names, they didn't went and invented all of them, right? Another,
yeah,
this is,
there has to be a James, there has to be a John, because this is already pre-formatted. Yeah, right.
Another important point is that there are multiple instances in the Gospels when one has to make a judgment call on where a character is the same character or a second character. For example, is Simon the leper the same as Simon the Pharisee? There is debate about this. It's not clear. There are two stories, and people are not sure. Is this the same event, or is the event where Jesus gets anointed? Right? Okay, so that's also.
Yeah, and it's worth. I should add here that Simon, although that's not an Old Testament, or at least a major mythical Old Testament name, it had a huge mythical resonance because there was a really famous Simon who was the high priest of the temple when Alexander the Great came. So there were a lot of these legends about Simon the high priest and his interaction with Alexander the Great that became very symbolic of the intersection of Hellenism, modernity, their version of modernity, and Judaism and its faithfulness and stuff like that. So Simon is also a very mythically rich name. So it's a name that a fictional author would be attracted to in the same reason that they'd be attracted to Mary and Joseph and these other, Jacob and these other, which is James, these other sort of famous mythical names. So a myth writer is going to be attracted to these names just as much as actual parents were when naming their kids. So there's no way to tell the difference between what you call onomastic congruence and the myth writer's tendency. So I wanted to point that out because a lot of people don't know that Simon is a mythically rich name as well, and that's why it shows up a lot.
Yeah, so the bottom line is then if you remove those names that were not contested or being invented, then the data reduces to 32 names, and 24 of which appear only once. So you're basically doing a statistical analysis from 8 data points, and this is very little to conclude something important.
Yeah, there's so much wrong with this mathematics. You're right. There's so much wrong with the mathematics here. And Balcom, by the way, never does any math. He just makes these claims, right? So he doesn't do any statistics or any of that. He just made these claims, and the Christians just believe them. So he never did any mathematical analysis of well, can I even make the argument that I'm making, right? So like you said, if there's only 8 data points really, then statistical anomalies are going to be through the roof. I can't give you any kind of statistically reliable answer as to the name frequencies here. It's you could pick any multi-name tomb where definitely all the names in that tomb are real people in Palestine, right? We've got a lot of these. And look at them all, and they're all going to be very different. None of them are going to look or very few of them look like the Bible. There's a few that come close, but that's just by random selection, right? And by random selection, you have this huge. Each tomb by itself looks different from every other, and yet those are all historical, right? And so that's the same kind of problem here. Is like you can't do the statistics that Balcom is actually claiming. Certainly not on a single gospel like Mark, where there just aren't enough names to do what you're talking about, like you said.
Yeah. Or is another thing I wanted to show. I found something cool on Reddit. It's a post by Gregory, the guy who made that story. And here's the interesting part. He's saying he has made a call to response, and he's waiting for to peer review to publish. And here's what he says here in the part in the red part. He made he made an analysis in fictional text like Clementine homilies the Acts of Pilate and blah blah. And he says that he also got Onomastic congruency from this fictional thing. So one of the claims was like, no fictional book ever reaches Onomastic congruency. And he claims here, this is very interesting, Gregory claims that he has found some fictional books that managed to reach Onomastic congruency. So when he publishes, this is going to be very interesting.
I'm so looking forward to this article because I know they were doing this. I'm aware of this, and they do such good work, Gregor and Blythe together, that I'm really looking forward to that response. And that, by the way, the article that he's talking about that they're writing a response to, I cite that in Obsolete Paradigm. So if people want all of that data, it's there. And then keep your eye out for this other one. Unfortunately, in this field, peer review can take 6 months to a year. So we might be waiting a while, but nonetheless, it's worth waiting for. That's going to be a great article.
Yeah.
But were likely included to function as living footnotes to indicate reliability. One should not doubt their account, because they list eyewitnesses who were present and can verify their reports. Likewise, when Mark wrote and named individuals that were not relevant for telling the story of Jesus, the reason is they likely are eyewitnesses or reliable tradents that he was aware of and can confirm his account. Such a practice would be useless if Mark was writing a fictional account.
I want to show something here. He says, this is not relevant. Okay, how on earth is this not relevant? I mean, really.
I think I know what he means.
Likewise.
Yeah.
I think I know what he means. First of all, he's completely wrong. There was no such practice. No one ever did this. This is not a thing. When authors meant for you to understand that they were citing a witness, they said so, right? They don't just put a name in there and just assume the author or the readers understand, oh, that's my source. They never did that. There's 0 examples of that ever happening in the entirety of ancient literature. Nobody just threw a name in and just assumed that the reader would know that was their source. That wasn't a practice. If the author wanted the reader to know what their source was, they would say so. They would just say, I talked to this person, or according to this person, or whatever. They would say that. So that whole argument is ruled out, right? It's just done. They walk away. But what he's asking is, so the argument he's making is, you take the Rufus and Alexander example. There doesn't appear to be a story relevant reason to mention their names, right? It's like, why are their names there? And so what the gullible Christian here is doing is saying, oh, well, it must be sources then. But that doesn't agree with the practice. When names are thrown out like weirdly like this, and this happens a lot in fiction, myth and fiction of antiquity, you get a lot of weird sudden names. Why are these people being named? Why are these names here? It's not source. It's because the names are symbolic. They represent something. Triads of names especially. You find a lot of these name triads. Name pairs and name triads are very common in mythology. So if you look at Mark, if you consider the Rufus and the Alexander example, so you have a triad. You have Simon of Cyrene and his children, Rufus and Alexander. When you see something like that in a text that always, like just every chapter is full of allegorical argument. All right. So it's like, there's a lot of symbolism. There's a lot of deep meaning. There's a lot of structural meaning and stuff. It's literary art. Every chapter of Mark is literary art. And I have several articles on this on my blog, and I talk about it, especially in particular with Luke. I talk about it in my new book, Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus. But the thing is that when you see an author who's doing symbolic writing over and over and over again, chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter, and then you see this, statistically, statistically, what are the odds that he's doing the same thing? Obviously high, right? Like Mark never cites sources. He constantly makes up things that have symbolic meaning. So the odds are that this has some sort of symbolic meaning. The names mean something symbolically, mythically. There's some sort of reason, mythical reason for them to be there. We might not know what it is. Just like, there's 153 fish in John. That never happened. No one sat down and counted 153 fish. There's no miraculous catch of 153 fish. Like that never happened. It's a literary story. And the number has some sort of symbolic meaning. Now, we might have lost that meaning today because people back then had access to a ton of information and assumptions and things like that, sources and stuff that we don't. So it's a lot of this information got lost. So someone back in John's day probably understood what 153 fishes meant. The best example we have from Jerome, who says that there was lore. It wasn't true, but there was lore that there were 153 species of fish, and so the 153 fishes represents all the nations of the world, so that the gospel will rope in all the nations of the world, and it was doing it through the symbolic mention of 153 fish as the sort of all the species of fish, all the species of men, fishers of men. You see the connection, right? It falls together, but you would have to know all of this lore as the average reader would to catch that point, right? So when we're looking at Alexander and Rufus and so on, we can reconstruct what would be in the mind of someone, what they would think the mythical reasoning of that was, and even what like a preacher preaching from the text of Mark might even used as like he used this as his lecture notes as the cue to like explain what the significance of these names are, and it's a gospel relevant significance. And I explore that. I talk about that on the historicity of Jesus, and I have a blog article on Mark where I talk about other aspects of this, like the naming of the women and stuff like that, where they have significant mythical senses. The specific names of the Marys is really important. That's a good example of triads, and also like pairing them with places and other associations that give significance that is mythical. So the tendency in Mark is to make up names for mythical reasons. So we should look for a mythical reason first before, and if it was a source, he would say it was a source. He doesn't. So we know that's not the case. What we have instead is this sort of significant idea. And so we should go looking for what is the most plausible mythical meaning that would fit. I've found one that I think fits really well. I won't go into that, but if people want to dig into that, they can dig into my literature on it. But there's good reasons for this. Anyway, again, you got to be really gullible to fall for this particular argument when you're kind of missing Mark's point. If you actually think that he's citing these people as sources when he's not, he would do so if he meant to.
The next is the...
Richard Bauckham points out Mark uses a literary device called Inclusio of Eyewitness. This is where one refers to their primary eyewitness source at the beginning and end. And Mark opens by referencing Peter and ends with a reference to Peter. We see a similar technique in other biographies. We also see Mark use a plural-to-singular narrative.
Yeah.
Go back to that. Go back to that last slide. That one that that he showed.
Similar technique in other biographies.
This one.
Yeah.
This one. Okay.
Yeah, I don't understand why they think this is an example.
Yeah, I have some great responses to this. I found something great. I found Lydia McGrew disagrees with this. Listen, I'm gonna show it here. Inclusio of Eyewitnesses. Lydia McGrew has a YouTube video arguing against this argument. She
Yeah,
thinks,
I like it. Okay, yeah.
Look,
and people should know Lydia McGrew is a Christian apologist, so this is she's criticizing her.
Right.
It's worth pointing that out.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, it's important too. Yeah, because maybe not everyone knows it. She's a Christian apologist. She thinks she disagrees with that. She says here, I just don't think this device is really there. I question whether such a device even existed. Basically, the argument is simply that some biographies name their main witnesses at the beginning and at the end, and therefore this was a device. Okay, it's very weak.
Yeah.
And
right.
She makes
this is not a device that's made up. Like she's right. McGrew is right. That there's no evidence of this being a device. There are inclusio as a device. The idea of chiasmus, sandwiching, ring structure, all that's real. But for it to indicate an intention that you're citing a source, that's not the case. There's no example of this being a method of indicating source. No one would have understood that to be the case back then. So yeah, it's a made up idea. There's no truth to this.
Yes, that's right. This is from her blog. She made a review of Baucham's book, and she says, I consider this weak. Baucham's entire case for the existence of such a technique is his own inductive claim to have found in the Gospels and 2 other ancient biographies he discusses. So it's just 2 examples of the hundreds of biographies that we have that by chance had this. And she says
also I just point out that that example itself is not even an example, right? So like there's no reason to believe that that's what the author of the Life of Alexander means, right? He's just assuming, because there's a reference to a writing, but he doesn't say I read this letter or I got this from that letter, right? So like even their example is fake, right? Like it doesn't really indicate source. Like the author is not describing a source. They're just telling a story. The story just happens to involve a letter being written, but they're not saying if they read that letter, if they know about that letter from another source. Like they're not telling you what their source is. They're just telling a story. And Inclusio is just a method of telling stories. It doesn't have anything to do with signifying sources. But anyway, yeah, but can keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what she says in her blog. It wouldn't be all implausible if that person was important for that person to be named by chance, both early and late in the text, right? That's the main point of it. Just by chance, a person got named just by mere chance, right? He found 2 biographies where a person was named early and late by pure chance, and he says like, "Oh, this is a device," right? But that's very weak, very weak.
Yeah, no, it doesn't signify source at all. Yeah, they're right. Yeah. Okay. Dumb argument. Another gullible argument where they just believed Baucham. He just made a claim. It has no support whatsoever. There's no reason to believe it. But gullible Christians just eat it up. Yeah, that must be true, man. They're just like Papias. They just leave whatever urban legend comes across their desk. And it's like, I do feel like this is why they're Christians, is that they're so gullible. Like they just fall for stuff like this. And the rest of us don't. And that's really just the difference.
Yeah. So this is the last point, the last
singular narrative device. This is where a plural verb without an explicit subject is used to describe the movement of Jesus and his disciples. But then it is followed immediately by a singular verb or pronoun referring to Jesus alone. It is most often used when Jesus and his disciples are moving from place to place. For example, Mark 1:21 says, "And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching." Mark 11:12 says, "On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry." Now, if Peter was reciting this to Mark, he would state it as, "We came from Bethany, and he was hungry." Mark would then write the we as they, but retain the sense of the group moving as one. If Mark was getting his information from someone who moved around with Jesus, we would expect this plural to singular device. Going beyond this, we find extra details that center around Peter's and
so at first I was like, I didn't get it. I was like, I don't get it. Why does this show?
It's so gullible. Yeah, this is another really gullible thing. But go on. Yeah, keep saying what you're saying.
I found something online on Baucham's blog. He tries to explain it better. So here is the explanation. It's like, okay, here is what we find in Mark's gospel. Okay, something that reads weirdly. For example, they went into the temple and he was hungry, right? It sounds weird. It sounds kind of weird, right? They went and he was, it sounds a bit weird. Now, the idea behind it is that this comes from somebody narrating this to Mark. Okay, we came to the temple and he was hungry. And somehow, for some reason, he thinks that that sounds less weird in this way. He's like, okay, in that way, it sounds less weird in the we way. But I don't really get it. I don't really get the argument. Do you get it?
It's just grammar. You're telling a story about a famous guy, Jesus, right? You're telling a story about Jesus. He has an entourage. So you have to start everything with they moved. Because if you didn't, then if it said he went to a place, the assumption of the reader would be that all the other guys stayed behind. Right? So like the whole point is that you got to move the characters from scene to scene. So it has to start in plural. But it's a story about Jesus. So that they move from scene to scene, and then Jesus did a thing. Right? So you have to move to the singular. Like the fictional structure requires this structure. There's no other way to write it. You can't say we went to Capernaum and then we went up and taught the Torah or whatever, right? Obviously, it's no. We went there and then Jesus did a thing. That's you. There's no other way to tell the story. So yeah, this has no indication of eyewitness source or truth or anything. It's just a completely made up thing. And so for people to fall for this, it just really astonishes me that anybody falls for what, like Malcolm is just making stuff up, literally just making things up over and over and over again, and people just believe him. I just don't understand it. Like you said, you don't understand it either. It doesn't make any sense as an argument, but they fall for it. Just hook, line, and sinker. I don't know what to say.
I guess one could say that the less weird way to word this would be, for example, to say they went to Bethany and Jesus was hungry. To use the name Jesus instead of he, because when you say they went to Bethany and he was hungry, it does sound weird. It does sound a bit weird. But here's my thing. It also sounds weird in the other way. If a guy is an eyewitness and he was narrating this as we went to Bethany and he was hungry, it also sounds weird. So it sounds weird in both ways.
Yeah. It actually doesn't sound weird. So like, because it's a story about Jesus. So any switch to the he is automatically understood. Like this is just a common literary device. So like there's like to an ancient Greek reader, this wouldn't be weird. They would follow it easily. Like this would be a normal way to tell stories. So I don't even think that it's weird to begin with. But like you said, no matter what you do, it's weird, I guess, to the modern ear in some way. But it isn't really. I don't know. I'm sure you could find modern fiction that does the same thing. But the particular storytelling style this requires this sort of method, and there's nothing weird about like making the reader assume who he means. They obviously know who he means, right? So like because it's been set up as the shtick that they're doing over and over again, so they don't have to keep repeating the name over and over again. Maybe modern fiction has some sort of like stylistic need to do that, but ancient fiction didn't.
Right. Okay, so we are done with Marcus' video, and we can just take a brief look at the other Gospels, what he says about them. For example, on Matthew, one point he makes is how Matthew talks a lot of money, and this how allegedly. I just have a slide here.
So does Luke, by the way. But anyway,
Yeah, so Matthew has a lot of parables, a lot of stuff when he mentions money, taxes, payment. So this allegedly this shows that Matthew was written by a tax collector, right? This is like the evidence here, So
yeah, but Luke does the same thing, right? Luke has a lot of money talk. Luke is a much more sharper critic of wealth and the rich than Matthew, but Matthew's doing the same thing, and Luke's borrowing a lot of Matthew's material. Obviously, like that's in Paul already, right? Like concern about sharing wealth, the idea of the wealthy not sharing their money being a problem. So like the whole idea of critiquing the wealthy for not caring for the poor is fundamental to the gospel. So obviously, if Matthew wants to build out that idea in detail, that's what he's going to do, right? There's no way they're going to skip over this subject of wealth disparity when it's fundamental to their entire message, right? Mark is very brief. Like Mark does it too, but he's very brief. So Mark is a very short, brief thing. Matthew wants to build this out, so he has the 5 great discourses that build this out immensely, which usually gets associated with Q. I don't believe Q is an actual document, but if someone did believe in Q, a lot of the stuff comes from Q in that sense. So anyway, so this doesn't indicate anything, and there's nothing in Matthew about the tax collector being the author. That's a later legend. So that's another example of we really can't buy that.
Yeah. It's worth pointing out that even Richard Bachman, who Inspiring Philosophy bases a lot of his work on, believes that Matthew was not the author of Matthew. He believes that it kind of comes from Matthew, but it's not. He believes that it's not the author. He believes that this is wrong, and he has some arguments for this about Matthew being named Levi or something like that.
Yeah, because the name gets switched between Matthew and Levi between the Gospels. There's no reason given for that, so we can't infer anything from that about authorship or anything. But yeah, I'm aware of that being a factor. So
now let's take a look at Luke. About Luke. So basically, he says, there's one argument about the beginning of Luke. He says that he got this from eyewitnesses. Luke explicitly says that he got this information from eyewitnesses, right? That's one point. And another point is how Luke has a lot of medical language, right? And this allegedly shows that Luke was the doctor, the physician, right? So that's the two like arguments.
Yeah. There is no medical language. There's nothing distinctively medical in Luke. That's a really dumb argument. There's another example of gullibility. It's no more medical than you or I talking about getting a bottle of aspirin, right? Like normal people use medical language all the time. There's nothing distinctive of a medical professional in Luke, right? So like medical knowledge was ubiquitous. People use medical language all the time. So there's nothing weird about that. And also, like, again, the legend, Luke, the gospel itself never says it was written by Luke or by a doctor. That comes from a forged letter, in fact. Like, the Luke being a doctor is in one of the letters of Paul that's a fake letter. So, like, the guy's not even real to begin with, this Luke the doctor. So it's already, like, this is just a telephone game of urban legends. This is Haitians eating pets all over again. It's made up stuff. But could you pop that back up?
Yeah.
The...
Oh, this is John.
Yeah, one before that. Yeah. Luke. Luke absolutely does not say that he interviewed eyewitnesses. This is a modern urban legend, right? Like he says one thing, Christians hear something else somehow, and then go on repeating this lie no, he doesn't say that. He says actually the opposite of this, is that he says that he does say there were eyewitnesses and that they passed down a story that he has received. He doesn't say he met any of these eyewitnesses. And he says that he didn't critically examine the stories. He claims, I'm doing it really accurately, following exactly what I was told, because it was told to me that it was passed on by eyewitnesses. Like, that's what he says. So Luke is really just declaring a really gullible methodology as well. Although I think Luke is just being dishonest. I think he has, like, Luke clearly, if you go for the book of Acts, Luke has disdain for historical truth. Like, he wants to rewrite history to be the way he wants it to be. He's not actually interested in accurately preserving anything. And we know this because we know two of his sources are Matthew and Mark, and Luke runs roughshod over those, right? He borrows them verbatim, but then changes them, then drops things, and so on. So he's not precisely preserving Mark and Matthew. He's not doing the thing that he claimed. And again, that's the Mark and Matthew are examples to him of the message being passed on by eyewitnesses. I don't even know that Luke himself, the author, believed this, but he certainly is claiming it. But he doesn't claim to have met any of these people that he didn't interview. There's no interviews. There's no reference to interviewing. It's just a precise oral lore that he's supposed to preserve perfectly and never question. That's what he says, which is the opposite of what is being sold here. The idea, I should point out that the idea that the we passages have less Semitisms, I haven't seen a really good demonstration of that. So I don't know what that's really about. Luke is very much in Septuagintal style all the way through. So I don't know. I don't even know what low means. Like, so there were some Semitisms. Like, what does it matter? Like, if there were absolutely no Semitisms in the we passages and then tons of Semitisms in the non-we passages, you might have an argument. But if there's just sort of a up and down frequency of Semitisms chapter by chapter, that doesn't tell you anything. And I have an article on what the we passages in Luke or in Acts. If people are interested in that, you can go to my blog and read what scholars actually say about this. It's not this. They're not that. Most scholars are not this gullible. But so yeah, that's just a bunch of bad arguments that require tremendous lack of critical thinking to fall for.
Yeah. Okay. And last, we have the Gospel of John, and basically that's what they say. Well, I think he says that he's an eyewitness. Like this,
he does not. But okay, yeah.
Yeah, I don't. You know what you're referring to, right?
That's the same thing, where the authors say one thing, and then modern Christians, for some reason, hear something else. It's not what's in the text. This comes from John 21, which might not even been in the original gospel. We're not really sure. There's a complex story of the redaction history of John, but what the authors, plural, say is that we consulted something written by this witness. They don't name him. They don't call him John. The witness doesn't exist in any other version of the story, so it's clearly a made-up witness. When you look at the redaction history of John and the contents of John, it's very clear, and a lot of scholars have pointed this out, and I cite all the literature on this on the historicity of Jesus. It's very clear that witness was supposed to be Lazarus, the resurrected Lazarus. So it's a made up character that didn't exist in any other version of the story. It's clearly whoever wrote the early redaction of John invented this character, invented the idea of him being an eyewitness, and then invented the idea of him having written something that they used as a source. But we don't have that something, right? So they're not saying that they met this guy. They're saying that he wrote something and they just believed it. We just believe it, and we're just going to tell you it. Now, what might have happened, and because of the redaction history of John, what might have happened is that it was originally a Gospel of Lazarus, and the last redactor decided to basically refer to an early redaction as this writing, so that when they say that this witness wrote this down and we believe it, they might be referring to the original redaction of John that we don't have. And so that might be a late redaction reference to the early redactions that they changed. They moved there's evidence that they moved things around, took things out, added things, and so on. So our John is a highly redacted version of some previous version of John. So that might be a late sort of nod to the existence of the earlier redaction. But the early redaction was a fake gospel written by a fake person. It's all fictional, right? So anyway, but it does not say, absolutely does not say, the author does not say that they were there, that they were this witness, and so on. It's not in the text. It says the exact opposite of that. So you can't get to that point.
Yeah. So that's basically, that was it. That's what I wanted to show.
Yeah, good. We did that in just a little over an hour. Excellent.
Yeah. Do you have maybe some final words on the Gospels or whatever, or these kind of things?
Well, I think this was a good structure. So we covered basically all the main arguments that usually get said about this. So yeah, I think there's not really much more to say. People who want to dive into this, we've referenced a lot of materials and scholars that people could dig into to pursue this further. But yeah, ultimately, really, it's just the same message I've been making the whole way. Is that I think modern Christian apologists, just like ancient Christian apologists, are intolerably gullible. They just readily believe things that they shouldn't be believing. They don't have a critical mindset, and I think that's why they fall for this stuff and why they're still Christians. And that's really the lesson, the overall lesson to take away from this.
Yeah, I agree, of course. So, okay, thank you very much for coming again. It was great to have you. Guys, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and see you next time. Bye.